So back when I was a kid growing up talking politics with my uncle, like all kids learning about politics, you got to figure out what the difference is between a Republican and a Democrat. And that was a challenge for me as a kid because I had two Republican grandfathers who I loved and looked up to so much. Then my mother was a Democrat and her mother was a Democrat. So you could imagine my grandparents on that side of the family, you could imagine their house around election year with a Republican grandpa and a Democratic grandmother. They had some disagreements, I'm sure, and they went to the polls and voted in opposite directions, but I know for a fact they both were strong believers in democracy. As I was growing up trying to figure out, which side do I fall on here, I was drawn to the Kennedys. I was fascinated at a young age by John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, and I began to dive in and study what it was that they stood for. And as I began to dive in and study what it was they stood for, I realized that that's the party I would want to be associated with. They were people who stood up for the underdogs. They championed equality. They championed everyone getting a fair shake. They championed going after corrupt families and, ending corruption. And they were two men that I considered heroes as a teenager. Also, as I was growing up, I began to realize that the Republican Party was just always dangling things in front of my face to try to get me to vote against my own interest. And it offended me. It still does. But it offended me as a teenager when my uncle began to point out, hey, the only time these Republican politicians actually put on these flannel shirts and these jeans when they do their campaign ads is just when they do their campaign ads. The only time they ever walk down a dirt road or walk into a factory is when they're just doing a campaign. And they use the religion and they use the Bible to get people to vote against their own interests. And that stuff offended me. So I was just always drawn to the Democratic side of the aisle. And I was always a big fan of the Kennedys. So had you told me back in the 90s when I was a teenager, if you said, hey, one day Bobby Kennedy's going to have a son that's going to come up in politics and, he's going to run for president one day, I would have said, wow, that'll be pretty cool, because I would have thought to myself, well, if he comes up and carries on the family tradition of what the Kennedys stood for, that would be a really cool thing. And now we see RFK Jr. out there endorse Donald Trump, which is the exact opposite of everything that his father and his uncle ever stood for. Now, I know what some people would say. You'd say, well, you're just saying that, Brando, but you don't really know the Kennedy family. But here's his sister, Kerry. The whole family is against what he's done. And here's his sister, Kerry, echoing the same thing I've just sat here and said.
I think this is really the stakes this November couldn't be higher, which is exactly why my whole family will be fighting so hard to reelect Kamala Harris and Coach Waltz, who've been champions for the values that my family has fought for years. Donald Trump is the polar opposite. He's a threat to the most basic freedoms that are core to who we are as Americans, the right for women to control our bodies, the right to live in communities safe from gun violence, to love who you love. And I think if my dad were alive today, the real Robert Kennedy would have detested almost everything Donald Trump represents. His lying, his selfishness, his rage, his cynicism, hatred, racism, fascist sympathies, deliberate misinformation about vaccines, criminal felony convictions. Daddy was the Attorney General of the United States. His rape of E. Jean Carroll, his contempt for the poor and suffering, for ethics, democracy, healing, his cruel sneering at human rights for suffering people in America and around the world. And these are the causes that was loved so passionately by the real Robert Kennedy. So I'm outraged and disgusted by my brother's gaudy and obscene embrace of Donald Trump. And I completely disavow and separate and dissociate myself from Robert Kennedy Jr. in this flagrant and inexplicable effort to desecrate and trample and set fire to my father's memory.
Folks, that truly is sad. It's actually hard to watch because I can't imagine what it would feel like to see your brother go out there and just disgrace your family's legacy like that. I remember going and visiting the graves of JFK and RFK, and they had actually just buried Teddy. The dirt was still fresh on his grave back when I went. And I just stood there looking at those graves thinking, dang, what history is here and what an impact these men had on our country and on the world. And I stood there looking at those graves and my blood just ran cold. And when I saw RFK Jr. walking up those steps to go shake hands and endorse Trump on stage, my blood ran cold, but for a completely different reason. I just felt so sick to my stomach watching it. You know, when he came out to suspend his campaign, he talked about how that the Democratic Party was against democracy. He basically just flipped the script and said everything that we say about Donald Trump. He flipped the script and said all that about Democrats, that they were the party that was against democracy. They were the party that was going to usher in a dictator. He completely flipped the script. And this would be my argument to that. If he truly believes those things he says about the Democratic Party, why in the hell would he look over at Donald Trump and see him as the alternative? Why would he look over at a man who tried to overturn an election he knew he lost and sent his followers to attack our nation's capital? Why would he sit there and be for someone who was found liable of sexual abuse and then defame that person? Look at all the things Donald Trump done. Everything that Donald Trump has done is the very type of thing that his father worked against and stood against. Donald Trump is the very kind of people that Bobby Kennedy vowed to put an end to here in America. That's the very type of crime family that he said, we're not going to allow those people to walk all over people anymore. And that's the very kind of person that his son went out there and shook hands with. It's just truly disgraceful. And I'm seeing so many ridiculous memes floating around right now. It's just sickening. You know, I saw a meme on Twitter, someone shared it, showed Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and RFK Jr., and it said, all former Democrats, all have had enough. First of all, RFK Jr. was born into the Democratic Party, and he has completely went astray. Second of all, Donald Trump, I wouldn't call him a Republican or a Democrat. If he's cozied up to Democratic politicians in the past, it's because that's what was popular to do at the time, and it was all about the money, and the same goes for Elon Musk. These guys aren't Democrats or Republicans. They just use whichever side of the aisle they want to use at a particular point in order to get ahead in life. It's disgraceful to when people says to me, yeah, Trump used to be a Democrat, that makes me so sick to my stomach, because no, in order to be a Democrat, progressive, liberal, whatever you want to call us or label us on this side of the aisle, you have to stand for certain things, and you have to be for those things. You have to stand for equality. You have to stand for freedom. You have to stand for democracy. You have to stand for everyone in this world getting a fair shake. You have to stand for reaching down and helping the downtrodden and picking and lifting people up. And these people have never done those things. They've worked against people every step of the way. And it's truly, truly sad to watch. But don't be duped, don't be fooled by the RFK Juniors, and don't be duped and fooled by people that says Trump used to be a Democrat. No, they've always been grifters. They've always been con men. And if the Kennedys was here today, they'd be ashamed of RFK Jr., and I promise you, they'd be rallying against everything that Donald Trump is out there trying to get done.